to BookEnds Online Edition, produced by the Wadena County Historical Society and Travel and Storyseller in collaboration with the New York Mills Regional Cultural Center. BookEnds is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to the legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Bookend programs from earlier this year are now available on the website for the Wadena County Historical Society at www.wadenacountyhistory.org. Today's program will be available on the website shortly. Books from today's and other Bookend speakers are also available on the website or directly from Travel and Storyseller. The website is www.travelin, that's TRAVELIN apostrophe storyseller.
No apostrophe.
It's a little dash. That doesn't work?
No.
Okay, so Travel and Stories. .com. Oh, right. Okay. BookEnds. Sorry, Gillette. So let me, just to make sure that we all got that, it's www.travelinwithnog storyseller.com. Right? All right.
Right.
There. Get your books from Gillette. BookEnds is a monthly literary event connecting readers and writers. During the pandemic, it will be held via Zoom on the second Saturday of the month at 11:30 a.m. Next month's speaker will be Gretchen Anthony, author of The Kids Are Gonna Ask. And today's program features J. Ryan Stradal, author of The Lager Queen of Minnesota. J. Ryan grew up in Hastings, Minnesota, where they have the cheapest gas, by the way. His first book, Kitchens of the Midwest, was published in 2015. It reached the New York Times hardcover bestseller list at number 19 on its third week of release. The Lager Queen of Minnesota is his second book. The novel became a national bestseller its first week of release and was featured on the New York Times book list. The Washington Post called it the perfect pick-me-up on a hot summer day. If you have any questions for our author, feel free to enter them through chat, and we will ask them throughout the program when it is time. And without further ado, because I'm having one of those mornings, let's just go right to J. Ryan Stradal because he's probably way more interesting than me. Take it away.
Shelley, that was great. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on BookEnds. It's wonderful to be back in Wadena, even if it has to be virtually. One of my favorite book events of all time was in Wadena a few years ago when I was touring for Kitchens of the Great Midwest. We drew quite a crowd on a weekend afternoon. I think we figured out it was something like 2% of Wadena's population. It was really awesome, and I give Gillette and her mother all the credit there. They brought great food and drinks, and really made it like a hometown atmosphere. And it's wonderful to be back. And thank you for having me, and thank you for inviting me. I can also recommend the next month's author, Gretchen Anthony. She's awesome. She's very funny, another Minnesota-born, raised author, and her second book is wonderful, also set in Minnesota. So thank you also for highlighting authors of local ties. As Shelley said, I grew up in Hastings, Minnesota. I didn't know it had the cheapest gas. That's awesome. I'm glad we're getting famous for something good. Most of the time when you tell people in Minnesota you're from Hastings, they give you kind of a side eye, like, "Oh, okay, that explains it." You know, like I think Hastings natives have a reputation in Minnesota as being a little weird. You know, we are exactly between Coke Refinery, which is now called something else, but it was called Coke Refinery when I was a kid, in the nuclear plant down on Prairie Island. So it could be something in the water. But I moved to Hastings in 1980. My parents both grew up in Minnesota. My mom was born in Fargo. My dad was born in Mora, and they met in college at UMD. Dropped out after a year. My dad enlisted in the military, was sent to Japan during the Vietnam War, and they liked it so much they stayed longer. However, they wanted me to be born in the US, so they came back here to Minnesota, where I was born. And I was I was raised by two parents who read a lot, and I think that was probably the biggest influence I had in my life to be a writer, was seeing my parents, particularly my mom, sitting around the house reading. And she went back to college. Both of my parents went back to college and got their degrees as adults. My mom in her mid 30s when I was a little kid, and she would read her homework to me as bedtime stories. So as a real little kid, I heard passages from Jorge Luis Borges and James Joyce and Chaucer, and all of it pretty much went right over my head, I'm sure. But I know what didn't get past me was my mom's love of reading and love of language. And I thought as a young child, probably the coolest thing I could do, or the most impressive thing I could do in the eyes of my mom, would be to write a novel. So my idea of writing a novel when I was a kid was to take my favorite book at the time, which was Richard Scarry's Cars and Trucks and Things That Go, and written by Ryan Stradal on the inside cover, hand it to my mom and say, here's my novel. And she put the kibosh on that idea. So it ended my career as a plagiarist pretty early. But what she did tell me was, you got to come up with the stories yourself, come up with the words yourself. And at first that sounded really hard, but as time went by, I realized that's even better. Make up my own stories. So when I finally had a short story assignment in grade school, in third grade, I wrote a story called The Party. And it ended up being 11 pages long, single-spaced, pencil and line paper. But I think at least 7 of those pages were a list of people invited to the party. So it's not an impressive story, just a little overloaded with characters. I think I still got an A on it, and that was very encouraging. Nancy Teckham was my third grade teacher who encouraged that. But I had other wonderful teachers in grade school too, like Gretchen Caldwell, now Gretchen Irvine, my second grade teacher, and in my elementary school librarian, Mrs. Schultz, was tremendously helpful to me as well. And so I felt like, boy, I had a lot of encouragement both at home and at school with the school library and with my teachers to be a writer. But it took a long time for me to feel like I was confident enough in my writing to concentrate on fiction. When I went to college, I ended up majoring in radio, TV, film, just because I was pretty sure by then I wasn't ever going to make a living as a writer. So I thought I'd try to find something creative to do to make money. And I thought, well, yeah, maybe I can work in one of those 3 things, radio, TV, or film. And I did end up doing that. I ended up working in television after college. I moved to Los Angeles, where I followed the advice of a professor I had, and ended up working at Vh1 and then MTV, and then a number of other networks and production companies. I worked on early seasons of The Bachelorette. I worked on a couple seasons of Deadliest Catch, a couple seasons of Ice Road Truckers, Storage Wars, in Storage Wars, Texas, which is what I was working on when I was writing Kitchens of the Great Midwest. So I worked in TV for about 15 years. I was story producer, coming up with the narrative for these reality or unscripted programs. That's, I ended up at VH1, and that's what they did. So that's what I learned how to do. And I think it taught me quite a bit that I was able to apply to novel writing. For example, in Deadliest Catch, we shoot, I don't know how many thousands of hours of footage an episode, between 10 and 20,000. And it gets pared down to 42 minutes. And so you have to be pretty unsentimental with your editing. You've got to look at story elements and ask each one, does this move the story forward? Does this entertain or inform? Does this reveal character? And if it doesn't, it's out. So applying those principles to my fiction writing was really useful. Plus, this was especially true of Kitchens of the Great Midwest. Working in television taught me the importance of the act break. So I ended every chapter on a cliffhanger to keep people reading. I didn't do that quite as much with Lager Queen. I think by that point I was already about 4 years out of working in television. But with working in kitchens while I was working in television, there's a lot of that, a lot of those kind of act break chapter endings. But yeah, kitchens also, very fortunately, took me around the country. I did over 120 events for kitchens in 3 years, including the one here in Wadena. And luckily, it took me to a lot of small towns or smaller towns like the one I grew up in. One of the things that was really important to me as a young reader in Minnesota was seeing Minnesota represented in books. It just didn't seem to happen all that often when I was a kid. I mean, there were authors like John Hassler. I remember reading Simon's Night in high school, but that seemed like kind of an unusual thing. Like, oh yeah, here's this Minnesota author who has a book set in Minnesota. And it was kind of an aberration. So I remember thinking as I started taking night classes at UCLA to study fiction again and get back into writing stories, I thought I want to set more stories in Minnesota. I want to write for the 10-year-old, for the 14-year-old, for the 18-year-old me who really wanted to see Minnesota and Minnesotans represented in fiction. Also, it's my home state, and I always call it my home, and I think about it all the time. I'm always reckoning with it in my memory. It made me who I am today, and the people there certainly did, and I feel I have a lot to say about it, or a lot to add to the social conversation about Minnesota. I don't feel like I'm writing anything definitive about Minnesotans. Like the Minnesotans in my book certainly don't describe all Minnesotans everywhere. But, you know, growing up in the 80s and 90s where there wasn't a lot of representation, and then you get movies like Fargo, which I enjoyed the film, but it casts a really long shadow over the rest of America in terms of its representation of Minnesotans. We're certainly not all like that. We certainly don't put our neighbors into wood chippers that often. And the other Minnesota voice in popular culture, Garrison Keillor, is also, you know, it's a relatively small sliver of Minnesota life. And I wanted to broaden that and add to this conversation. And thankfully, there's far more representation of Minnesota authors. I mean, right off the top of my head, I can think of a few books I really enjoyed in the last year, like Gretchen Anthony's book, The Kids Are Gonna Ask, Lorna Landvik's books, Peter Guy, Sarah Stonich. I just finally got my first Leif Enger book, Peace Like a River. I haven't read him yet, but a Wisconsin author named Leslie Kagan recommended him to me. And I've been hearing about him for years, and we were talking about him, and she said, I can't believe you've never read Leif. And I said, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get around to it. And so she said, get that one. So I did. Oh yeah, and William Kent Kruger, of course. I just read his latest book a few months ago, and it's wonderful. So now there's so many Minnesota authors, and I feel, and also authors who've moved to Minnesota, like Curtis Sittenfeld, and it feels wonderful to be part of a larger conversation now about representations of Minnesota in literature, which takes me to Lager Queen. Now, one of the things I learned driving around the Midwest in Minnesota and the Great Lakes area was there's an awful lot of new breweries around. Or one of the things I discovered was you roll into towns like Wadena, or not much bigger than Wadena, and they'd have a brewery. And it's my understanding Wadena has both a brewery and a distillery now. And I'd go, wow, that's pretty cool. Because my memory of bars growing up as a kid in Hastings was that bars weren't for families. They were kind of prohibitive and kind of unappealing. Like the places where adults went to drink didn't look that fun. They were dark and kind of creepy and kind of hostile. That was my impression. If that was the impression my parents gave me to keep me out of bars, they did very good. I mean, they did very well. They, you know, they disabused the notion of a bar as a cool place. But frankly, a lot of the bars that I observed as a kid didn't didn't draw me in. They didn't seem like, oh, this is where you're gonna have a fun time. Uh, and I think that is I think that stands in really stark contrast to the vibe of the breweries popping up around the northern Midwest that tend to be family friendly, pet friendly, have live music, have events, and be open air places that are bright and sunny and have games and theme nights and are very welcoming and often open air and festive places like the beer halls of Central Europe that inspired them. And traveling around the Midwest, I also found out that in the 1800s and late 1800s, this exact same phenomenon existed. That there were over 4,000 breweries in the country, and most of them were in the Great Lakes area in the northern Midwest. And I thought, oh wow, so we're really returning to a history here. What more is there? And in doing research, I found out that women invented beer and were making it for thousands of years before money and religion got involved, and that there were women brewery owners in the 1800s. And I thought, boy, I want to tell that story. There's a lot going on here. There was so much appealing to me about setting a novel in the world of beer. And there was so much I didn't learn about. There's so much I didn't know about it. So I created 3 characters, Diana, Helen, and Edith, none of whom knew anything about beer at the beginning of their story, of their character arcs. And I sent them on a mission to teach me about beer. So as they learned about beer, I did. And I think by doing that, I was trying to restrain myself from sharing the knowledge of all my beer research, of just like doing an info dump onto the reader of beer facts, and instead just keeping it to what was relevant to the character. So if Edith needed to learn something about beer, that's what the reader learned. She didn't need to learn everything about beer and tell the reader everything. So it was fun to send each of these 3 characters on a mission to get beer in their lives somehow, especially Edith, because Edith is largely based on my grandmother Doris, who, like Edith, worked in the kitchen of a nursing home and would do little things every day, every week to improve the lives of the residents there. And I really wanted to read a character like that in fiction. And I figured, well, you know, may as well start. Because the other fun thing about Edith is Edith hates beer, just as my grandma Doris does. Wouldn't touch it, you know. You know, she'd have the occasional like ripple or something like that, but wouldn't, you know, generally didn't drink much and certainly not beer. So I thought, how can I put this person on a trajectory that they might find a beer they enjoy in life? So that was my mission with Edith, was to crisscross her with beer in a way that she would make it her own. But when you meet her, she's pretty far from that. I'll read just a couple paragraphs. So if you haven't read the book yet, you get a little taste of Edith. It was July 5th, 2003, and Edith Magnuson's day hadn't been too bad so far. She'd just taken a strawberry rhubarb pie from the oven and was looking for her favorite tea towel when she saw a small grasshopper jump onto the white trim of her windowsill. She didn't like the idea of the little bug sitting there, all vulnerable, so she gently poked at it with the handle of a wooden spoon. As she'd hoped, it jumped into the yard and vanished into safety. Edith felt herself exhale. But then she felt terrible. Maybe that little bug just wanted a vacation somewhere, and she came along and ruined everything. Edith, for one, never once really had a vacation herself, never really had a break of any kind, but, you know, then again, she never intended to take one. Things were pretty decent where she was, and she didn't ever see the point of bellyaching about the things she couldn't change, especially in a world that has never once ran a want ad looking for a complainer. So that's Edith. That's her personality. You know, she knows that the world has never once ran a want ad looking for a complainer, so she tries not to complain too much herself. She sees something wrong or sees something that needs improvement, she just quietly fixes it and goes about her day. However, sometimes, like with the grasshopper, she feels a little bit of consternation over whether or not she did the right thing. Yeah. So yeah, I think she's a very sweet woman and inspired by the women I grew up with in Minnesota. And I feel like putting her on a track where she was one day going to get involved in the beer industry was a fun one. Now I had another character, Edith's sister, Helen, who from the beginning knew she was going to get involved in the beer industry. Now, Helen and Edith are about as different as siblings could possibly be, which in my experience tends to happen probably more often than not. But unfortunately for both Edith and Helen, their father, who was a farmer, left the farm and the inheritance entirely to Helen and left nothing for Edith. Now, Helen had a mission in life to become a brewer. She knew this from her first taste of beer, which I believe was a Fitgers in the 1950s, behind the barn with the Saracen boys at their farm in northern Minnesota. And she went to college specifically to major in chemistry to learn how to be a brewer. And there she met a man named Orville Blotz, who was the heir to a fictional beer empire called Blott's Brewery. I made sure to also mention Blatt's Brewery in the book so people didn't think I was just stealing Blatt's. I like the sound of the word Blott's. And they came up with an ad campaign where the slogan was, "Drink lots, it's Blott's." The problem was they didn't have a pitch man. And at one point in the mid-1970s, when they're trying to market light beer for the first time, right around the time Miller was, they discovered they need an ad campaign to tell people about the virtue of light beer. And I'll read just a little bit from that section where Helen and Orville and their business partner, Joe Foxworth, come up with a plan to market Blott's Special Light in 1975. Helen and Orville took out a small loan to help buy ad space and produce local spots. And even if it would suck up over half the funds, Orville was convinced they needed a celebrity pitch man. And this is where Joe Foxworth proved his value. "Hey, I know a guy," he told Helen one afternoon as she was walking out of the bathroom. "My brother's freshman year roommate at Augustana was in training camp with the Minnesota Vikings. His name's Rudd Herzog. He said he'd do it." Helen wasn't really listening, so she was impressed. "Your brother has a friend on the Vikings?" "Well, he didn't make the team, but he lasted until final cuts." "Oh, so he's not actually on the team, Joe?" "Oh, well, no, but he's a big man. He still looks like a football player." "But he isn't one, and nobody's heard of him." "Well, no," Joe said, "but trust me." So using his own money, Joe shot a spec commercial with Rudd Herzog, which Helen and Orville weren't even aware of until Joe showed it to them on his home film projector. Joe flicked off the lights, and the image of a giant bearded man wearing an unspecific football jersey appeared on a pull-down screen. "Hi, I'm Rudd Herzog. You probably don't remember me from my career on the Minnesota Vikings. It was my lifelong dream to play for them. Last year, I had my one chance, and I didn't make it. That was real depressing. We've all had days like that, I guess. After getting cut, I felt like drinking a lot of beer. Thank goodness my local bar had Blott's Special Light. With its easygoing flavor and low calories, you can drink a ton of them. You can drink it all night and you'll feel all right. Drink lots, it's Blott's." It's kind of sad," Helen said. "I don't know." "Well, I like it," said Orville. "He speaks for a lot of people right now." Joe nodded. "Yeah, I sure hope he does." All right, so that's the second excerpt of The Other Sister. There's a third character, Diana, too, but it's hard to read an excerpt of her without kind of giving a lot away. I mean, she comes in the second half of the book, so I'll leave her for the reader to discover on their own. But those are the 3 point of view characters, these 3 women who all find their way into the world of beer in different ways through different intentions. And so it's a little about beer, a lot about family, a lot about siblings, and a lot about Minnesota. So if there are any questions at this point, I'd be happy to, or take any questions from Shelley or Lina or Gillette or anyone else on the call too.
Well, I know Gillette was curious. Excuse me. It's been one of those mornings. I know Gillette was curious. She loves the Vh1 Pop-Up videos. Did you ever write any of the trivia for that?
Oh gosh, no, that would have been awesome. I think that was done out of New York and I was working out of Los Angeles, but I would have loved to have done that. That was such a fun show. That was still being produced when I was working there too. So that was on, and so was Behind the Music. I did some writing for a Behind the Music spinoff called BTM2, which was a half-hour behind the music for artists like Beck that hadn't really had like a heroin overdose in their band, or like they hadn't yet got to the point of their career where they had suffered a lot and bounced back. They were still kind of on the way up. So that was probably the most well-known series that I wrote for. Most of the projects I worked on for VH1 unfortunately didn't last longer than a season if they aired at all. Yeah, but I would have loved to have worked on Pop-Up Video. That was a lot of fun. Yeah.
So Gillette also wanted to know your first book was about food, your second was beer. What's the third one going to be about?
Well, I've been working on it. I just handed it to my editor about a month ago. It's largely set in a supper club, which I know this crowd will be familiar with the terminology. I mean, in California, the term means like several $100s a plate, reserved meal, special pop-up somewhere quite often. But in Minnesota and Wisconsin and the upper Midwest, it means a specific kind of restaurant that doesn't really exist elsewhere in the country. So that's a major setting, is a supper club that gets passed down through the generations. There's also another restaurant in the story that's kind of modeled after Perkins or Baker Square. It's kind of a pie-oriented family restaurant that becomes a chain. And so it's a restaurant story, but also a multi-generational family story. I just can't quit those.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this one has a grandmother, like a mother, daughter, and granddaughter, and husband is the 4 point of view characters. So 3 generations represented once again. So we'll see what happens. I mean, I just handed in the first draft. Could be not all 4 of those characters make the final cut. Yeah, we'll see what happens. Yeah.
You write a lot of women characters. I have some questions about that. Like why do you pick women as your main character, and do you get some pushback from like women authors like, well, what do you know? I mean, not that they weren't great or recognizable as women. And I personally don't like that critique that people say, well, you can only write what you know. Like if you're a white man, all your characters have to be white men, and then they complain that your book has no diversity but only white male characters. But I was wondering like what led you to pick women as your main characters?
My mom's influence. I feel I write to her. She's my reader. She's the reader I think about when I write. Like, would she like this? And also because she passed away 15 years ago, I write to keep her alive. I put her in these characters. I think I write best when I'm at my most open-hearted. And when I think about the fact that my mom's never read any of my books, or I think like, well, I think in some ways like I'm trying to stock her library in heaven, but also keep her alive by writing characters influenced by her, writing characters that she would enjoy, and putting her into my characters. There's a lot of her in Edith, a little bit of her in Helen, but I could channel her quite a bit when writing these characters and think of her saying, oh no, that person wouldn't say that. That person would say this. where she's kind of the editor in my head. And so at its best, I think writing for me every day is a conversation with her where I get to keep her alive and honor her legacy and her influence to me by putting her into my characters. So a lot of the characters come out as women.
Cool. Did you ever get any like pushback on that from people about?
Maybe the occasional reader, but it's been kind of rare. Yeah, once in a while, but yeah, probably not that often. Yeah, yeah, I can't think of a specific instance. It's been a while. There was a event I did in Los Angeles at my neighborhood bookstore where someone had that question, where they phrased it somewhat confrontationally. And I said an answer similar to the one I just said now. It's like, well, for me, it's personal. It's not, I sit down every day and I think about what would my mom want to read, and and that makes it easier. It just makes everything kind of fall into place in my head. And I think of the kind of characters I want to talk about, and also really honor the people I love that are still alive. I think of two of the women that influenced the characters in this book, my Aunt Connie and my Grandma Doris, and they don't get books written about them very often, the kind of life they've had, and they certainly didn't have the sort of bandwidth or free time in their lives to sit down and write a book themselves. So I figure, well, I'll do my best to try to do them justice and give them some representation in my pages. I'm certainly not trying to be anybody's definitive descriptor of what a Minnesotan is or what a Minnesotan woman is, but I feel I'm able to do my best to add to the conversation by honoring the women I know in my life, like women like my Aunt Connie, who worked until their late 70s, and women like my Grandma Doris, who didn't get a driver's license till she was 57, and then worked into her 70s as well, and then volunteered avidly in the years after that. Like women that were very active in their community and very active in helping the lives of other people, and often ways that were very quiet and not public. People that you notice if they were gone. You don't necessarily notice the things that they do because they're so subtle about it, but if they didn't do them, you'd notice. It's like when a highway isn't cleaned or something like that. Yeah, I mean, these women were tremendously supportive of me and made me who I am today. And I feel like, oh, wow. And when I pick up books and I see a lot of, unlikable narrators or people with kind of contemporary problems and handling them in aggressive or what's the word, or conflicted ways, I think, well, okay, that's there's certainly readers for that, but I also wanted to read characters like Edith, who I don't see represented in fiction a lot. And so I thought, well, hopefully more people will write characters like her. More women and men will write characters like her. But I felt like, the least I can do is add to the conversation and throw her out there and see what readers think.
No, I think they were very much recognizable both as women and Midwestern women, actually, because I'm originally from the East Coast. I was
Cool.
Yeah, I was raised in Western New York, Rochester, New York. When I say Rochester, people think Rochester, Minnesota, but
sure, yeah. I'm from Rochester. Oh, cool. Yeah. You know the Mayo Clinic? Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Heard of it? Yeah.
strong hospital, strong.
Mm-hmm.
So in Kodak.
Yep. Yeah.
But yeah, it's kind of interesting because there is a difference when you come out here meeting people and stuff. So it's sort of interesting to like read these stories and be like, oh, okay. So it sort of makes me feel like I know them a little better, because what you see when you're standing on the other side of them and they're talking and you're like, well, they just have a different approach, the Midwestern women, and to things than an East Coast woman does.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of interesting. And I think you capture that, and it's sort of recognizable. And Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. Yeah.
um, so Gillette had another question. She says, "You're a new dad. Congratulations."
Yeah.
And she was wondering if that changes your perspective on writing parent characters. Like, do you see um your parents and parents in general differently now that you are one of the club?
Oh, certainly. It's hard not to. You know, when you're raising a small human, you know, who's right now he's 7 months old. You know, you think, oh boy, like my parents did this when they were 25. How do they do this? Yeah, yeah, you gain a lot more appreciation for them, and one of the reasons I wish my mom was alive would be to express more gratitude toward her for the work that she did, because you don't understand it until you're a parent yourself. You know, the quiet things that are done to build a life. And oh, it's been wonderful. I mean, of course, it's wandered into my fiction. Some of it got into Lager Queen, but there's a lot of parenting small children, and um, the things around that in my third book that I was writing now, because that was the book I was writing mostly while Brooke was pregnant and after Audie was born. And so, yeah, there's a lot of influence from my current life into that one. But yeah, it also makes you think, oh, what kind of world do I want to create for this person and surround them with? And that also influences the stories I write about and the characters I write about. Yeah. So yeah, no, it's been great. I see I have a question from the Wadena County Historical Society privately to me in chat that I can answer right now. And it was, what contributed to the success of getting on the New York Times book list? And well, I I think there were a few things involved in that. One of which, and I can't um, overstate this, I had a lot of support from my publisher. I was fortunate to have an editor who really championed the book pre-publication, and I was fortunate to have a publisher in Viking that was um, very adamant about prioritizing my book, um, getting it out there in the world to booksellers and media in advance of its release. And so for a debut author, that was irreplaceable. And I feel very fortunate to have had that support from them. Um, and, you know, because a lot of people were able to see the book before it came out. There weren't a lot of other books like it. I mean, that's why I wrote it. And it's sort of scary when you think about it. I wanted to write a story set within the world of Midwestern food because I couldn't find one. And therefore you also think, well, maybe one doesn't exist because nobody wants to read that. Certainly when I was writing the book, I thought, oh, maybe 3 people will read it, you know, my dad, my grandma, and my brother. But my grandma didn't even like it that much. The language in that book was too much for her. She didn't like the swearing. So I was limited to just feeling like I'm writing this book in a cave. Like I was living in a small apartment in Hollywood at the time, writing for nobody but me and my mom, kind of, you know, thinking like, oh man, I just wish she were alive to read this, and I'm just going to put this book out because if I knew this book existed, I would buy it. This book would sound really interesting to me. So fortunately, other people agreed with me, and they were interested in reading about the rise of a Midwestern chef and varieties of Midwestern food as well. So yeah, I think that it got good reviews early on. That helped too. I mean, I didn't have any kind of platform. I was not, you know, remotely famous. I didn't have a lot of, you know, a few fans of my short stories, but not enough to like move a needle at all. So if it wasn't for the support and faith of my publisher, getting the book to people before publication, it wouldn't have been the same journey. People might have found the book, but they would have had to work harder to get it. It would have been a slower burn over a longer period of time.
I have to say, as someone who's worked as a bookseller for over a decade, um, I worked a little bit for Gillette and I worked at Barnes and Noble.
Oh,
The getting those um reviewers copies, which this is one. I have
yeah,
it.
yeah, awesome.
Yeah, I liked getting them ahead of time because it gave you sort of an edge. You were out in front of what was coming out, and then you could help people. And I mean, people who love books and who love reading love to share that with other people. So I thought the greatest thing in the world is giving free books to people that sell books because
Yeah.
then we can read it and be like, yeah, this is awesome. Because when I find a book or a writer I really like, you can bet I'm pushing them hard. And I know booksellers all over the country do that. So all you have to do is find some booksellers who really like your stuff and they will do the work for you because they believe, because
Oh,
they want to share great books with people that love books.
the independent booksellers have been so um, instrumental and so important to me. I wouldn't be anywhere without them. I feel like their support is what's made me be able to be an author. I look around the country at the various independent bookstores that I visited, and I'm just uh, blown away by the um, support I've gotten from them. And yeah, as an author, there's no substitute for those hand sales and recommendations from booksellers. And they get so many, as you remember, Shelley, like you get those galleys, but you also get a lot of them. The sales reps will come in and tell you maybe, oh, if you like this book, you'd like this one, or move this one up the pile. And I had sales reps, from Penguin Random House support the book and support both of my books in different regions and get those booksellers to read the galleys. So when the book came out, they could make those hand sales, and so that helps so much too. But ultimately, it's up to the booksellers. Like when the customers come in and ask a question like, "What do you have that fits X, Y, or Z?" If they know that in their head, if they like, oh, this person's looking for a story set in Minnesota, or this story is looking for kind of a lighter summer read, or any other categories that Lager Queen could fall into, they know it and they can put it in their hands. And there's no substitute for that. No algorithm can do that.
Yeah. Well, Gillette's been talking you up since she met you at a spring forum when the Kitchen of the Great Midwest came out. She's like, "Oh my God, you got to read this author. I love him. He's so great."
Oh, thanks. That's so sweet. Yeah, I remember that. I was so intimidated. Those early events where I'd meet all these booksellers at once, like in New York and in Minneapolis at the um, Midwest Independent Bookseller Association meetings. I was like, oh, it's overwhelming, but irreplaceable for meeting people like Gillette. And then what happened after my publisher-sponsored book tour ended, I paid for more book dates. The reason I went on so many events was because I met booksellers like Gillette and I wanted to go see them. So I did it under my own dime, paid for it myself to fly out and rent a car and drive around the Midwest and hit these smaller towns that were like the one I grew up in. Authors didn't often come to Hastings. I wanted to do something about that. I wanted to be the author that would go outstate and go to the smaller towns because the publisher would pay for me to go, to Chicago and San Francisco and Houston and so on. And those were great too. But to me, I'm from a place that's like Wadena in a lot of ways. And I want to tell my stories there too, because I am who I am because of Hastings, Minnesota, and Minnesota generally. And if I didn't come back and read in those towns, I feel like I would be doing myself a disservice, and also doing the 10-year-old me a disservice, or 12-year-old or 18-year-old me. I mean, plus it's also to me a great way to honor and give back to these independent booksellers who took a leap of faith on my books and hand sold them to people. If I can come and, hopefully put some butts in the seats for them and help them sell some more books, I'd love to. I'll jump at the chance to do it. I just wish I could do it this summer. I mean, Audie's 7 months and he likes being driven around. I think he'd be a fun companion to have on a book tour. And, who could say no to a little baby, and standing there holding the signing books, he'd be more popular than me, more people would want pictures with him. So I really miss not having that opportunity this summer, but I'm grateful for this. I'm able to do a Zoom event. Yeah. So I can still participate in the Wadena community, in the Wadena County community, because it was really important. It would have been really important for me to come out and do this if I were able.
Well, certainly an in-person book tour over the summer, you would have had a lot of more than willing babysitters while you were presenting.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah, like, hey, can anyone hold the baby while I read? Like, maybe a lot of hands would have gone up. Yeah.
Author, what author? Give me the baby.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's a baby tour.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, yeah, there's a book involved, but yeah, I don't remember the title. Just come see his baby. Yeah, no, he's a great little boy, and he's just now at the age where he's starting to get around. He's doing that kind of army crawl, and oh boy, yeah, he's getting into things.
Yeah, it just picks up speed from here. I was there with Gillette when hers were little, and now they're teenagers, and I'm like, wait, what?
Yeah. Well, the fun thing is that I get to be like Lars from my first book now, and I get to think about what I want to feed him. Yeah, now that he's finally old enough to eat everything except for like honey and sushi. We've been feeding him both green and yellow curry. We made him like an ottolenghi dish that had Ras El Hanout in it. So he had like Ras El Hanout at 6 months. I probably didn't have that spice blend until I was like 42 or something. And so he's getting a real he's getting a real wide variety of food for his age. I really enjoy that. I really enjoy seeing like what he thinks of something, so I fed him some lemon yogurt this morning, and he was into that. Not at first, but the only thing that I can definitely always win him over with, unfortunately, is applesauce. So he's I gotta keep broadening his palate. We just fed him some chicken piccata yesterday, so I'm trying to get him more into savory and not just sweet. I'm trying to get him some umami.
Got to get that variety in early.
Yeah, and so he also gets acclimated to it. Like, kid, this is what you're going to be eating. Sorry, your parents are going to be having tamago, so you're going to have tamago. Get with the program. Yeah. One thing, I haven't experimented with giving him really spicy food yet. That would just seem kind of mean. I'll wait for him to be a little older for that. But everything else, that's healthy to give a newborn is fair game, and it's been a lot of fun.
Cool. A question about your books have excuse me, multiple characters point of view, and I've noticed that sort of or maybe it's not a trend, it's just I happen to read a number of books recently that all had that. I kind of like it, actually. There were Midwestern authors too, but they had different perspectives, and it kind of makes the story fuller because you're just not relying on one narrator to tell you. But does it make it harder to write the book and to make sure that you're being clear as to each voice so that they all sound different?
Yeah, my habit for that is to only write one character a day. That generally keeps it clear in my head. I mean, when I'm editing or doing some cleanup work, I'll work on multiple chapters a day, but when I'm writing new material, I write characters one at a time. So like, for example, with Edith, I'd write all of her chapters and finish her whole story, then move on to another character for a month and a half. Or however long it takes to write that first draft of a character's chapters, and just stay with them and let them live in my head. Yeah, I can't hop around characters' voices in one day
Yeah.
very effectively. I really have to live with somebody until they're telling me what to say, until I'm literally hearing them. They're in my head. It's like having, it's like I don't know, like sharing a studio apartment with somebody or like that. You know, it's
Yeah.
eventually like you can predict what they're going to tell you because you just see them all the time. You know, you're just occupying an intimate space with them. And so, yeah, that's my discipline and practice for that, is to segregate the characters during the first draft. So I don't write the book in order. I almost never start with the chapter that would be the first chapter. If my current book, the book I'm writing now, ends up going to press in more or less the form it is, it'll be the only time I've ever started with a first chapter. I just got a question. How long did it take from idea to first draft? Well, for Kitchens, I probably had that idea in around 2009 or 2010, and it percolated for a long time, and I started writing it in 2013. So I was thinking about that book for about 4 years and making notes and doing research, and then I sat down and wrote it in about a year. With Lager Queen, it was much more yeah, it was much more difficult. I had a due date. I didn't sign a 2-book deal, but I sold the concept for Lager Queen well. I was doing pre-publicity work for Kitchens, so before Kitchens had even come out, I sold Lager Queen, and I had started writing 2 chapters, and I sold it on the basis of those 2 chapters, only one of which is still in the book. And the remnant of it is a very small section of a Edith chapter that's about halfway through the book. So I wrote that book completely out of order. I had the idea for Kitchens, for Lager Queen while I was touring for Kitchens. And I talked about that at the start of the conversation, what those influences were, but I had to write it pretty quickly after coming up with the idea. You know, I had to put these influences together. Wanted to tell a story about unfairly divided farmland inheritance, tell a story about the history of brewing in the northern Midwest, and I'll tell the story of 3 people who set out to become brewers who, or who get involved in the beer industry in different ways, some of which they didn't intend. And so putting those things together so quickly, well, it ended up not being quickly. It took me 3.5 years to write that book, but the gap between idea and execution was greatly compressed. Like, I'd come up with an idea for a character and then write them the next day. So I didn't necessarily have a lot of time to sit with these people and get to know them. So I had to get to know them through rewriting, through revision, as opposed to, you know, my practice for Kitchens, which was to write long notes and lists about them in notebooks and think about them and add to those lists for months before writing them. So yeah, and with the 3rd book was a little more like Lager Queen, I think. I was able to take some notes and figure out who these characters were going to be before I started writing, but it was also pretty compressed. I sold the 3rd book before Lager Queen came out, so I've been working on it for about 1.5 years at this point.
Did you have like a plot outline, like this is what's happening before, like writing all the characters and how they're being affected by the events, or did, because I would think if you have a lot of characters all telling the same story, you need to know, like, this is the events that happen and these are their perspectives.
Yeah, each time I know what the ending is going to be. Each time I sit down to write a book, I know what the ending is. So I start far from that ending.
Yeah.
That's a really cheap way of writing a novel. It's like, oh, think of an outcome and then start really far from that outcome. Yeah, where with the characters in situations where maybe the characters who commit that outcome aren't even born yet, or are in a vastly different life circumstance that you'd wonder, how the heck are they going to get from A to C here? What could B possibly be? Like, that's going to take a while. So yeah, so knowing the ending helps, but along the way you figure out, oh, what's important to the character, what do they not want to lose, what do they want to gain, and you find ways of getting them to express their personality and their purpose through their reactions to the conflict in their lives, and hopefully through conflict with other characters that you're also hearing from. So you get a little bit of a she said kind of thing, right, going, where you hear different parts of a story that fill in the gap, and well, neither one is lying per se. Each are beholden to their own perspectives, just like we are in real life. Like, hey, this is true to me, so this is what I believe. And you know, it's always fun for me to read narratives like that. It's cool to hear that you've been enjoying them too, because I remember before I started writing Kitchens, I read a few books like Jennifer Egan's Visit from the Goon Squad, Jonathan Franzen's Freedom, David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, all of which had multiple narrators. And I was really influenced by that in thinking about how to tackle the story I wanted to tell in Kitchens. I thought, wow, you know, that would be a neat thing to employ. And because it's become increasingly common in contemporary fiction, I thought, well, this is one thing that isn't particularly, what's the word? Like out of step. Like I won't have to, you know, orient the reader too much. Because a lot of contemporary fiction readers will be used to this by now. I mean, obviously you still try, or, you know, make it clear, like, oh, when this person is talking, or when this point of view is taking over. But I was grateful to be able to write a story to a readership that, as you point out, Shelley, is already acclimated to this storytelling style. And I love it. I think it's a wonderful way to tell a story. And it's really hard to do in any other media, I think. I mean, you can try to do it in film, but I don't think it quite has the same effect because of what a reader's imagination is able to fill in these gaps. Yeah, I think it's, you know, when I sit down to write a book, I write a book. I don't write a movie. And this, yeah, this is one convention of contemporary literature I really love.
Yeah. Okay, so we're coming close to the end. So before we leave, we were wondering, we usually have the writers talk about like any advice they might give, because there's a lot of people in our audience that are writers themselves or aspiring, and any advice, or talk about processes or things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an MFA. I'm a kid from Hastings, Minnesota, you know, who doesn't even have an English degree. I read a lot. Probably the best thing you could do as a writer is to read a lot, especially read in the genre you want to write. Just read a ton of that, and get in your head the notions that create successful stories in that genre. I felt like, well, I want to write contemporary literary fiction, so I read a lot of it, and I think that's what made me into the writer I am. Along with also, you know, taking night classes at UCLA. If you can, find a community or a community resource wherever you are, whether if it's through an extension program at a college, or a community program like the Loft in Minneapolis, or even at a library like a short story writers group or a novel writers group. Find people in find a cohort that are around the same level as you. I was able to do that. I was in a short story writing group and a / like first novel writing group for a long time. And now I'm in a novel writing group with all people that have had at least one novel published. And so we've got problems and issues and things to think about that we can talk about freely amongst ourselves without annoying anyone who has yet to publish a novel, or baffling them, or so find people who are at your level and share your work with them, and all those things really did a lot for me. And when it's time to send your book out in the world, there's a great resource that helped me a lot called Publishers Marketplace. I joined them. It's a subscription. You have to pay for it, but it was worth it. You get access to all the client lists of every literary agent. So you get to see what's been sold, sometimes what it's been sold for, how many sales agents have been making recently. So when it's time for you to look for an agent, you can look for the agents who represent work that you feel is comparable to yours, see how busy those agents are, and reach out to them directly, because their contact info is on that site if you subscribe to it. I cold queried agents based on that, and I got good responses. And like I said, who was I? I didn't have any kind of platform. I wasn't famous. I don't have a MFA, but they responded to me. So when it's time, you can, from wherever you are in the world, you can reach an agent through Publishers Marketplace. Yeah.
Cool. And did you have the same editor on all your books, or?
Yeah, Pam Dorman. She's excellent. She's an absolutely superb editor. I'm very lucky to have her. She edited my first 2 books, and she's editing my 3rd. So, I've yet to get her notes on the 3rd. I don't know what she thinks of it, but hopefully she likes it. I know I have work to do on it, but hopefully not a terrible amount of work. We'll find out. It'll be fine. I enjoy working on my books either way. It's a pleasure and a privilege, even when there are a lot of notes. It's like a good problem, as people say.
Yeah. Do you find that your first draft and your finished published work is vastly different?
Oh, yeah, quite often. It wasn't the case with Kitchens. There were some chapters that didn't make the book. Kitchens was structured in such a peculiar way, with each chapter being an ingredient in a meal that gets served at the end in the final chapter. And so with that book, there were chapters I wrote for ingredients that are in that final meal that didn't make the final book. So that was it. With Lager Queen, my conception of the story and what was important to the story evolved while I was writing it. So I wrote probably 300 or more pages, but somewhere between 300 and 400 pages that didn't make the book that time. But with this newest one, I once again had a more compact notion of what was important to the story, just like I did with Kitchens. And so I think there's going to be fewer cuts. There won't be like on the order of 300 or 400 pages. For one thing, it's a much shorter first draft. I think I'm getting better at editing myself and hearing my editor's voice in my head when I write, so I can not overburden her with work. With Lager Queen, there was a tremendous difference between the first draft and the final copy, and I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful they were patient with me to take the time to make that book what it is, because I couldn't be happier with it the way it is now.
Wow. Well, I hope when it comes out that you'll actually get to come to Wadena in person, and we'll all get to meet and see you there and have lunch. Because that's the hardest part, is after it's over, you're just alone in your apartment and you're like, well, I wanted to talk about that.
I know. Yeah.
Nobody here.
Yeah, exactly. Hang out with readers, maybe go to the local brewery and, have a beer and talk about the books more, and talk about other books that we've both been reading and we enjoy.
Yeah.
Like Gretchen Anthony's, who you're having on next month.
Right.
It's a wonderful book, and she'll be a wonderful guest. She's very funny.
Yeah, I think we had her before with greetings.
Evergreen Tidings. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're looking forward to having her back again. And
it's superb.
Yeah. And so it just would be so much nicer. This is great that we still get to do this, but I think it's nice to get to really be there and meet. So.
Yeah.
hopefully we'll get to do that with your next book.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, it looks like it's time. And Wadena is getting a storm.
Oh, boy.
So thank you so much for taking the time to do this with us, and congratulations on your books. They really are very good. Thank you. And thank you for talking with us.
Oh, thank you, Shelley. And thank you, Lena and Gillette and everyone.